Hey Larry, wonderful to see you again. I guess it's been a few years,
I
you
think it
know.
has. I mean, between pandemics and touring and whatever, I'm sure I'm trying to remember what the last Stickman concert was that I had been to.
Yeah, but we met each other, I guess, like maybe 4 or 5 times even in the past 10 years,
Oh,
which was always nice uh, and really wonderful. You have a very positive aura.
well, thank you. And it's not anything I'm working on consciously. I guess it just happens, but thank you.
Hey Larry, so this format that I'm doing here with this podcast is that it's completely open, to talk about anything. And I'm sort of like really curious about you, I have to say, because I don't know that much. Okay,
Okay,
so
I'll try
so
and fill you in. Excuse
yeah,
me.
I hope you don't mind that, like at least to get started, I'll ask you a few questions, like about, like how you got to, the things that you are doing in your life and with your life, and what the driving forces are, what the history is. I'd really like to know something about that before we actually get to the music part or the technical details, let's
Okay. No, fire away.
say. So where are you originally from?
Actually, I was born in New Jersey. I'm still in New Jersey, but I've traveled all over the world and a lot of time in the UK over the years,
Hmm.
going back
Hmm.
to the first family trip in 1969, where
Hmm.
I was already enamored of things British, being a Beatles fan, and so my focus was always more that, and that includes music as well. My focus was on what was coming out of that and Europe itself, more than say the American bands from the West Coast or something. I was more drawn to what would later be called progressive rock in its formative years.
Hmm.
And
And how did you get into any professional work in Europe and the
um,
UK?
there was probably more audaciousness. It was a strange combination of events, which was that going off to college, um, I nominally was following a professional career path that was supposed to lead me to becoming a lawyer, but
Hmm.
I was still a music obsessive, both playing, and I'd been in bands during high school, and I continued some degree, although that began to morph into electronic work during my college years. But the main outlet, which was not a real curriculum thing, was college radio. And that's where
Hmm.
all the misfits and the musician wannabes and the music obsessives and those who would become music writers and stuff, we kind of became part of this extracurricular activity. But when you're living away from home, I was in another state, and in some ways that becomes your life. It's a band in itself. And the nice thing about, for me, was that unlike some of my other friends in radio, college radio, who looked at it as an apprenticeship to real broadcast industry, I wasn't that interested in the broadcast industry, but I saw it as an entry into the recording industry because I wanted to
Hmm.
do something. Producer, engineer, composer. I was trying on all the different hats and I wasn't sure which one would fit. And of course, radio was a great way to be exposed to a lot. You had all the record companies sending promotional materials, and the lowest ranking people within the record organizations were the ones who had to service the college radio stations. And
Hmm.
so they were usually fairly recent college graduates themselves, which meant they were about the same age, understood the feeling. And the path that had happened was discovery of unusual bands that were not getting a lot of play on commercial radio in America, but that people like me and my close friends who overlapped with musicianship ourselves would go, that's an interesting band. We got to find out more about them. And most of them were baby bands. These were bands that we thought had great potential to become. We thought that they should be the cultural icons, but they were virtually unknown. So the first one that we were dealing with was Yes. And they
Mhm.
were virtual unknown. They had had two albums out and in the UK. And I was fortunate enough to have actually picked up the first two when I was there at the end of the 60s. And then things started to evolve for them with the Yes album and then Fragile when it came out. But this band was still touring in a station wagon with a box truck, trying to get gigs in America. It was very, very early days. So when our little group of college radio people called up Atlantic Records and said, "You've got a band on your roster that doesn't seem to be getting anything. We really like them. We'd like to interview them."
Mhm.
Um, the label just jumped at it and they said, "Absolutely. Where are you?" We were in Pennsylvania. Well, they're playing a college in Pennsylvania, on Friday. Would you like to go? We'll make sure that management has passes and things. And it was just instantly in there. It turned out Rick Wakeman had been in the band about 16 weeks, I think, at that point, and the
Mhm.
album had come out and it was getting no traction at all. And it was so easy to go backstage. That was the night I met Bill Bruford, and we've known each other ever since. Um, Rick Wakeman, there was another guy with me, Frank Urbaniak. He plays and writes with the Dutch band Fractal Mirror to this day, even though he's had a very
Mhm.
successful professional career in corporate management. Um,
Mhm.
and he and I conducted these interviews, and in it, with Rick Wakeman in particular, I mentioned that I had been designing my own synthesizers because I couldn't afford a mini Moog like he had. I had to build
Mhm.
my own, and I had an electronics background that went back to my earliest days as an electronics hobbyist and then advanced amateur. And I told him what I was building. He said, "I want one of those." And he had the manager, it was either the tour manager or it was Brian Lane who was managing them. They were, all back in this. The concert was in a lecture hall at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and
Mhm.
he peeled off cash for me as an advance to build him one of these things. So I built a clone of what I had done for myself. It wasn't all that good. It was interesting. It made some interesting sounds, but I put it together and then delivered it the next summer, which was when they were touring Close to the Edge. And so that was 1971 into
Oh.
1972. And that kind of brought me into that world. I got to see, travel to a bunch of the tour dates, got to see how it all worked, what the live performance was like, a little bit of interaction with the label. Of course, the label was thrilled because we got a lot of press and media in our part of Pennsylvania. So it was good all around, and those friendships have endured. I'm still in touch with Rick. We pop emails back and forth, and I go see him when he's doing his grumpy old man piano concerts. And um, it was a great entry into that. Um, and it also, by the year following, by 1973, um, Rick had said, "Well, we're doing another album. Would you like to come over and give me a hand with a few sounds in the studio?" And it
Mhm.
was non-paying gig, basically. It was just come on over, and I was
Mhm.
thrilled. And so I spent a number of weeks on a daily basis while they were recording Topographic Oceans. And
Mhm.
I was kind of a fly on the wall. I was supposed to help Rick, but the band was beginning to dissolve, and so there wasn't all that much for me to do on that. But I did get to assist Eddie Offord, who was shorthanded. He didn't have an assistant on that recording, and in a way, that was sort of my production apprenticeship. It was the first time I handled 24 track tape, and he was really generous with his tips and techniques on how he handled his echoes, how things were patched, what he did to
Mhm.
make the Mellotron sound great. And it was very different than my encounters with American Studio, which prior to that included some of the big ones like 30th Street, CBS Studio in New York, but they were very rigid and there's a big focus, legacy of big band and jazz and a little bit of
Mhm.
classical, and rock was not treated well at all. So this was really good for me, and it got me plugged in. So I'm probably way off track on your question, but
No, not
any
at
any
all. I mean, Not at all. I think it's fascinating for me, and even though I'm sort of aware of that time, but I was born in '72, so obviously I wasn't there.
No.
And what was the context? Like what kind of commercial synthesizers were available in 1969 and
Well,
71?
yeah,
None.
well, the Moogs had been around because the Bob Moog and Herb Deutsch had developed the core architecture of the modular synthesizer in the summer
Hmm.
of 1964. They were both
Hmm.
college professors, and they took their summer breaks where the Deutsch family came up to Ithaca, New York, where Bob Moog was an electrical engineering professor at Cornell. Herb was a music
Hmm.
professor at Hofstra, and
Hmm.
they had known each other already through theremin, uh, other electronic music technology, but really put their heads together with what Herb as a composer needed from Bob as an engineer. And each of them, Herb was technologically adept, and Bob was a musician on some kind of an advanced amateur level. So they had a really
Hmm.
good common language between music and engineering. And that company had grown so that by 1969, 1970, it was kind of the king of the hill. And then the staff had uh, even though Bob Moog didn't want to do it, they had created this scaled down version of the most important features of the modular system in a box, and that
Hmm.
became Mini Moog and went through 4 iterations before the Model D, which was the 4th iteration that we know. And that hit the market in 1971. So that was out there already, and that was affordable
Yeah, I was
ish.
gonna ask. I was gonna ask that. Like how much was something like that?
It took it
Like.
from, in the low tens of thousands of dollars range for the modular systems, which
Hmm.
were mostly being bought by universities and research institutions. It wasn't a couple of big rock stars were able to afford it. So George Harrison and the Monkees got one, but mostly it was either that or people who had good need for something in commercial work. They were
Hmm.
already doing commercials or they had network connections and they could justify the cost. But the Mini Moog itself, I don't remember the original list price, but the street price was somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000, which was still a lot of money when you consider
Hmm.
under today's inflation rate, that still could be like $8,000 or $7,000. But
Yeah.
at least it took it from nearing, half the price of a house down to something that was sort of
Hmm.
reasonable. And there was
Hmm. Hmm.
competition. Alan Perlman had another big modular system with the ARP 2500, and that had been scaled back to create the Odyssey, which was a
Hmm.
mini like a 2 oscillator instead of a 3 oscillator. But again, in that same musician affordable range. At least it brought the synthesizers into the high end of guitar, finer guitar pricing. So
Hmm.
became more feasible. And those began to flood the market. And then, of course, the Japanese manufacturers jumped in.
Sure. But what is interesting to me is that you said like you had already also started building your own synthesizers around that time. So that means that you must have had an interest in doing that.
I did.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have done it.
No,
How did that come about? Like, for something that was entirely not an established technology or established musical instrument, like what was the path to that?
it
To
was
that.
actually, it seemed, it was a conjunction of two things that I was kind of obsessed with. I liked music. I was raised in an environment, parents and grandparents. Nobody was a professional musician, but there was some playing, lots of recorded music around, and mostly classical. My father had his big band collections. He was a huge Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman fan. So that when he got the first hi-fi that we got in the 1950s, a big mono block amplifier and a high quality Garrard turntable. It was the beginning of that audiophile world. big floor standing Electro Voice speaker, and I would just wrap my head around that stuff, no matter what was playing, whether it was a traditional classical Beethoven, Bach kind of thing, or a Gershwin thing, or whatever was in there. And I hadn't really discovered rock and roll, although rock and roll hadn't really reached the masses in the same way yet, because this is 1955-ish, something like that. So there's no Elvis breakthrough yet or anything. No Buddy Holly, none of the things that I'd later find interesting. But I like the audiophile aspect of it. I like the fact that there were glowing tubes and pilot lights that lit up. There was something fascinated me about all of that. The music itself sounded a lot better than the little tiny, like typewriter case sized child's music player that I had. Although that was sort of adequate, and that fascinated me. My grandfather was an engineer and technologist, and always had to have things first. So he had an early tape machine that he had gotten so that they could record me learning to talk. And so that's the early 50s. You know, he might have had an earlier one in the late 40s for all I know, but this was a kind of a big behemoth, quarter-inch half-track machine, pretty high quality, because even the amateur ones were just spun off from the studio Ampexes and the things that had been out at that time, magnetophones. And there's a picture of me, kind of pretend recording it, not even pretend recording engineer. I had a ride gain because you didn't want to overload it, and there were two little indicator lights. I got pretty good at riding the input volume control while things were getting recorded, and I'm about 3 or 4 at the time.
Wow.
Nice color shot of me sitting on the floor with this thing, and I still have that recorder because that's the one I later learned to edit on. So I was fascinated with all these things, and then my grandfather, who was the electrical engineer, saw that I really didn't care about football or baseball, and neither did he. And he basically in the 1910s been the same kind of nerdy kid I think he saw that I was developing into, and he had turned it into a career. And he made sure that he gave me the background, early circuit design. We learned to solder things together, you know, me as a 6-year-old, just making basic circuits. And it just expanded from that. We built a radio together. I helped him with some of his hi-fi stuff out at his place in the early mono hi-fi. He was big on building kits and then modifying them with his own electrical engineering design. Even that tape recorder was hacked. It had extra line ins and lines out that weren't part of the original design that he had added. And so I got pretty adept at doing some designs. I know he bought me an early transistorized oscillator. It was just a basic oscillator to be used. Ostensibly, it was for Morse code practice for ham radio operators, but it was just a little circuit board with a few components on it. And the circuit diagram was there, and we went over the relaxation oscillator and stuff. And I started hacking that so I could change the pitch, I could change the tone a little bit. And that just got me going. It was kind of informal, and it was me just going, well, I don't want just the sine wave, I want something else. And you know, again, I was pretty young on this. By the time I got to high school and the Beatles had happened, I was thoroughly obsessed with music. But even though I played a little guitar, played bass in my first band, only because I didn't really have a keyboard other than the family piano. I was looking for what could I build? How could I get myself some kind of electronic keyboard instrument that would be interesting? And I set down a number of paths trying to build things for myself. Most of them never reached completion as an instrument, but I learned a lot along the way. And then when the Moog synthesizers came out of the laboratories, and electronic music, which had been, well, I mean, you can trace its roots back to the end of the 19th century, but if you look in the post-World War II era, music coming out of Europe and what was being done here in the States, there was a lot going on. And yeah, I would grab any article I could find about it, and I just try to emulate things. I'd see what I could cobble together out of mail order electronic parts. and try to apply them into the band context, rock band things. So I was just there early because it interested me. The recording side
Yeah.
interested, the composing side interested me. It was just a lot that all kind of gelled around the same time.
Yeah, wonderful. I was also talking with Pete and Tony Levin about uh, their school years, let's say, of like learning an instrument. And I guess musical education in schools also was probably very different from how it is nowadays. Did you ever get any formal training?
Yes, so in fact, it started early. My my father played trumpet and had been in the marching band with his high school and stayed with that for a while. Had a really interesting looking trumpet because instead of being brass, it was copper. I don't know if it was copper plated, but the color was, a
Hmm.
very different color than everybody else's bright yellow gold instruments. Um,
Hmm.
and then my mother had learned violin from her uncle, and she had taken formal lessons as a child herself. So there was a collection of half size, 3/4 size, and full size violins that we had sort of inherited in our family.
Hmm.
My problem was that I had a pretty bad overbite as a kid. The front teeth were out. I couldn't really get a sound out of a trumpet, so it was decided I would take violin, which was fine. I like violin. In fact, there was a
Hmm.
thing about violin that sort of fascinated me and it frightened me. Found I don't know why, but when I was really little, I found the F holes and the scroll at the top and a few other things kind of frightened me, and I'm not sure why. But I figured one way I could get that under control was if I learned how to play that instrument, then it wouldn't scare me so much. And so
Hmm.
the schools offered free lessons, any kids that wanted to sign up. So I signed up or my parents, I guess, signed me up for violin lessons. And the school employed a roving instructor who also led the school bands and gave the individual lessons or small group lessons. And it was great. You got out of class, you want to look at history or math today. Well, you're going to get an hour over in the all-purpose room with the instructor. So I had
Hmm.
a couple of years of that, and that was, I mean, they started teaching us to read music right from day one. And of course, being
Hmm.
violin, it was all treble clefs. So bass
Hmm.
clef. I never got as good with bass clef, I think, as treble because I was imprinted so young with what the violin was. And
Same.
right from the start, we were learning pizzicato, we were learning all kinds of things, and I wasn't very good, but it was a really good inundation. Then family bought a piano in 2 years later, and we
Hmm.
actually hired that same school employee music teacher who gave private lessons after school, and he would come to the house, and me and my brothers would get half-hour lessons for years. I stayed with that right through high school,
Hmm.
but I
I
wasn't.
mean, not a bad introduction to have a violin as an oscillator, let's say, you know.
No, not at all. And I appreciated the sounds. I did love the sounds that a good player could do. I was never that good. I was always not using enough rosin or something. But and unlike the Levin brothers, I was terrible at practicing. I really liked coming up with things. In fact, this this teacher was very good in that he let me later. I would get one of these kids reduction things in junior high school or something on a Brahms piece or something, and I'd just alter it. I'd say, oh, that's not good. I'm going to change that bar to be this. One, I can play it more easily, and two, I think it sounds better. And he didn't slap me down on that. He kind of encouraged it. He found a good balance, and I like that. But I just knew I didn't want to be a virtuoso player. I wasn't looking for the concert stage. And then once rock
Hmm.
and roll hit, I just wanted to have the skills and facilities to do what I wanted in that world.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, like these traditional ways of learning about music and playing an acoustic instrument, sort of like when it comes to understanding or like, yeah, maybe understanding synthesis, you know, it's very, very useful. Like you said, you did pizzicato, you know, like what is the difference?
Exactly.
Bowing, pizzicato, and all of these things. I still find it fascinating, and I still call my guitar an oscillator or an input device even sometimes.
It's a perfect terminology for that. So it's I think it was getting inculcated into the vocabulary of sound early on, so that um, kids who didn't play instruments didn't quite know how things got created. And
Mhm.
as as we know, we can listen to a record, we kind of know what went into the production. We know what ingredients are in the mix and how they were put together. And it takes some of the mystery out of it, and maybe some of a particular magic of not knowing, but it substitutes it with a whole different skill set and a toolbox that you can use to create new things. So on the whole, I wouldn't change anything for me.
Sure. For me, my early musical education included already like being exposed to Karlheinz Stockhausen's music, because like he was an icon, in the 70s in Germany. And I lived in the same state. So I did get the state radio and like TV playing his music, or even TV programs about him. And so this early idea that like in the 50s, when they used the studio and the tape as a sequencer, like to kind of like record individual frequencies, and then they cut them and paste them back together, and for me that was just so fascinating. And this is coming like to my next question. So, but for me as a child of the 70s, sort of like the idea of what was going to happen with digital, right, almost seemed tangible already when I was a child. Somehow, like the imagination was going further than what was possible. So for me, when the digital synthesizers came, or when MIDI came, like for me, it was a little bit like, yeah, so what? I mean,
Yeah, I'm
you would
expecting.
expect that. Yeah, exactly, right. But from your perspective, like that must have been like a very different thing somehow, right? Or I mean, or even or the other way around. Like maybe
It,
for you had, I don't
yeah,
know.
well, it was I was exposed to a lot of things early on, and part of what my grandfather in his day job, which had been since right around the end of World War I, was with the United States Navy Department as a civilian engineering research and development. He ended up, they had a in Brooklyn at the Navy Yard, which was one of the primary sites of the U.S. Navy going back to the Revolutionary War. It actually had been the site of some actually terrible war atrocities by the British against the colonials in the end of the 18th century. But he was there through the whole research and development phase of that. And I used to get invited out to the labs. It was called the material labs. And ostensibly what they were doing was developing, new weaponry, and particularly in the Cold War, what was going on. But a lot of what he was doing as an electrical engineer, and he had a stronger early career in mechanical engineering, but a lot of it was communications and what was going on with the nuclear navy as it was getting built. A lot of that involved subcontractors, which included Bell Laboratories. So if you or your listeners aren't familiar, Bell Telephone was the dominant American telecommunications company that had tied the country together with transcontinental telephone in 1915. That had been a process of consolidating the smaller independent telephone companies from actually the end of the 1870s onward, until this incredible web of electric telephone work had been done. Bell Telephone in over the years had created a laboratory system called Bell Telephone Laboratories, or Bell Labs for short. And Bell
Mhm.
was kind of the really the leading edge, so that even the military industrial complex would come to Bell to find out what were the best technologies. Now Bell, and this the main Bell Laboratories building is within sight of where I live right now. And
Mhm.
That was coincidence, but it meant that when I was growing up, because I grew up not too far from here, and after all my sojourns ended up coming back about 40 years ago,
Mhm.
um, was there were north of 30,000 employees, researchers, PhDs, people doing solid state physics and what would become laser technology and all kinds of stuff. So everybody knew somebody who worked at the labs. My girlfriend in high school's father was an engineer at Bell Labs. So that, so many of my friends had connections, not my family because they were attorneys, but through my grandfather, there was a connection because he would come out on Navy business to the laboratory headquarters. Um, the one thing that, and I didn't appreciate it at the time, but we would be exposed to this even in our public schools, was that some of the public face of the research would spin off out of the labs. So by the early 60s, I remember one of the kids' fathers had come in to talk to the kids about what was going on, and he brought a recording of a computer singing Bicycle Built for Two. And it was the project that first created vocalizations by computer as a pure research
Mhm.
tool. Found its way into 2001: A Space Odyssey as
Mhm.
when Hal's being decommissioned and he reverts to his babyhood, and that recording is there. Well, this was around us, but it was, I thought everybody had exposure to that, but it wasn't. What I've discovered in more, well, not recent years, but in back in the 70s and the early 80s, was that PCM Digital was a major project going on during World War II for encryption purposes at Bell Labs.
Mhm.
And they had not invented PCM. That had actually been ITT in Belgium before the war, but they licensed it all and they brought over some of the scientists and they worked very closely. And they had teams of people, which actually included people like Alan Turing, who was sent over from the UK and spent time in this part of New Jersey during the war.
Mhm.
And they had brought uh, PCM digital audio to a fairly high art by the late 1940s. It was well understood. They began to apply it to long distance telephone work. The underpinnings for what would become the cell network were already on paper by the by the end of the 1940s. Had been laid out. Claude Shannon, who was one of the brilliant minds there, had basically laid out the architecture of an internet-like structure, which they envisioned would be an enhancement of the telephone network. Oh, I should also point out the Bell Telephone Network was, unlike many of the European and Asian countries, was a private company. It was not a government-run agency, but
Mhm.
it was a monopoly, but a regulated monopoly. So that this private company that did have shareholders could invent their own future. They weren't subject to that kind of government regulation, but they did have to stay out of certain areas of design and development. They could design, I shouldn't put it that way. They could design and develop, but they couldn't commercialize. So for instance,
Mhm.
the transistor was developed at Bell Labs. The William Shockley, the principal developer on that project, although his team did more than some more significant work than he did. He lived 10 houses away from where I live now on the same street. And all around here were people that had been involved in that. But they developed the transistor in order to make the telephone network more efficient. But when it was done, the US government said, you can't sell that on the open market. You can only grant licenses to other companies to do it. And their first two licensees were um, Texas Instruments, who went and ran with it, and Sony, who also saw the utility, and a lot of other companies didn't. But it just meant that it fostered a lot of growth. But in the meantime, Bell Labs stayed with digital and PCM, and there were a lot of fortuitous accidents. So people like Max Matthews, who was working in computers and with digital audio in the 1950s, got permission to start up what was basically a digital electronic music lab within this purely research and development facility. And they were very, very generous within the phone company for that, in that um, they were throwing billions of dollars at blue sky research because they were making money, because they were allowed to make money, but they couldn't commercialize out. They couldn't start building television sets or refrigerators. They were prohibited under their agreement with the government to have this regulated monopoly. So they did a lot of pure research that led to all kinds of cool stuff. And
So that means that like the technology, like if I'm understanding correctly, like the research was about 30 years happening about 30 years before there was commercial product,
yes,
or a consumer products, let's say, that use
that's
that
it.
technology.
Exactly. It's a pretty good timeline on it, because if you look at some of the papers on the encryption projects during World War II, where the Pentagon and Whitehall and Australia and the whole ANZUS, the whole Allies theaters of war were tied together with a digital network. And you look back at that and you go, kidding, it's all vacuum tubes. It's basically encrypted shortwave radio because there were no satellites or anything. But it was just fairly amazing. Some of it went on cable. But the math behind it, the theoretical underpinnings of, how do you encode and decode an analog world, transmit it, control it, network it, the routers that were needed, all of that. It's all falling into place already by the end of the 1940s. And then it just kept getting refined. And these spin-offs like Max Matthews and the speech and synthesis people, in theory, they're looking, oh, can we replace telephone operators? Can we create a synthesized voice? And then how do we create an interpretive one that can understand spoken voice to the computer? And so much was being done on that. And as byproducts, there would be operating systems like Unix, which grew out. That was an in-house Bell Labs project. Or they had languages A, B, and then C, and then C caught on, and then C double plus, which became kind of an underpinning of a lot of our modern stuff. The developer of that, I'm blanking on his name, but he lived about 4 houses away from me. I used to go over to his house. Was so impressed that even by like 1985, he had a Macintosh, not a Microsoft-based system, at his home.
So just did you ever get into programming, like computers?
Yeah.
Yes.
So what had happened? Well, first I had taken that in college, so I had Fortran and COBOL, and then
Okay.
because I was an arts student, and there were a handful of us, and we were clogging up the throughput work for the engineering students. Even though I took some engineering, but I wasn't an engineering major. My major was in history. The college bought us a Hewlett-Packard mini computer system that ran BASIC, which was pretty basic, but it was a lot. It was interactive. We didn't have screens, but we had teletypes with paper. But unlike Fortran, where you do your punch cards, bring your job to the computer center, hope it would turn around within 48 hours, and you had a misplaced comma and the whole job bombed out, and you'd have to start over again. With BASIC, in some ways less capable, but in other ways not so much. You knew when you made a mistake originally and immediately, because you get an error statement right back to your terminal. And I got pretty good at being able to take Fortran style programming and convert it into basic programs for that mini computer. And my roommate, who was an electrical engineer and didn't have access to this interactive system, I would run some of his stuff, and he could get a jump on his other schoolmates by not having to wait for the IBM system to turn around. So yeah, I started with that, and then I got out of college, and actually my nights in the computer center around 1973, that was the beginning of staying there all night and watching the sun come up, because I was just so in the zone of programming. And I really felt a loss when I left school, because I didn't have access to that anymore. I was now I was out in the world trying to make headway in the music business. But fortunately, microprocessors came along about just a little under 2 years later, the first outtake.
So when you did your first basic programming, did you
was
it a keyboard already, or was that still punch cards?
no, it wasn't
No,
punch cards. It was the well, do you mean the language basic or do you
the
mean
language, the language, the
the
language.
language basic was, that was it was a teletype. It was one of these things that looks like a typewriter keyboard.
Mhm,
And then it's got a big scroll of newsprint paper that comes up above, like where the screen would be on this computer.
mhm,
Um,
mhm, mhm,
and it would, you type in and you see your lines and you maybe, enter your programming or your programming module, whatever you wanted to test. It would be separate line items, very much like, you see basic. And then you,
mhm,
hit enter and whatever the go was or whatever that tells it to execute. And then if there was an error, the error statement would, you'd hear the chattering and it would
mhm,
print on the paper in newsprint, very much like a news teletype. They were almost the
mhm,
same technology. Um,
mhm,
you get a return from the computer. Sometimes it was a cryptic code you'd have to look up in a manual, or sometimes it was something obvious, or you got to know some of those cryptic codes because the
mhm,
same mistakes would come back. And you go back and you correct, or you get unpredictable results. But people were doing great things with graphic printouts using X's and dashes and things to make pictures of dinosaurs or pinups or print calendars. There was a lot going on. And of course, I knew there was going to be a computer to music connection. It was
mhm,
already there on some of the direct digital things. They were being done at universities, people out at Lejeune Hiller at IIT and at IRCAM in Paris. They were doing that. There was a lot of it. And at Bell Labs there was, but I didn't have any entry until 1975 when
mhm,
Bob Moog, who by that time I had gotten to know after recording my first albums. Um, and I'd been, since I was by that time I had little money, I bought Moog products. And so I was kind of an endorsee and they didn't have a lot of musicians who could talk engineering with them. So it was, it was a very good relationship. There was me, there was before me, Wendy Carlos. There were a handful of people who had both the science engineering background and the musical side. Bob Moog was invited to a project that was starting in Max Matthews' department at Bell
mhm,
Labs here in New Jersey. And he was up in upstate New York near Buffalo. And this would require going into the labs probably later in the evening, a couple of nights a week over a period of months, if not longer. And he couldn't commute like that. He had a company that he was struggling to retain control of, and they had other product lines going. And he, for whatever reason, I didn't know that I impressed him, but he recommended me because I was
mhm,
nearby and I could talk the language. And so I was invited in, and there were a handful of us. Lori Spiegel, who was deeply into it already, and I got to know Lori. I met her there, and we've been friends to this day. A couple of other people, Don Slepian. I don't know if you're familiar with his name. He's an
no,
American composer. His dad had been a groundbreaking theoretical, I think it was theoretical physics at Bell Labs. And he was the next generation, although not the academic scientist that his father was, but a really good musician. So he was on the
mhm,
project. Roger Powell, who was somebody I already knew, who was from Todd Rundgren's band, and he had been a demonstrator for both Moog, and was how I met him when he was working in the music industry. And he was doing some things. So there was a nice group of creative people, and we were the ones fooling around with the equipment after the grown-ups went home. And then a couple of the full-time employee, PhD level physicists and various projects. Lori was working on several different projects, including an older one called Groove, which was one of Max Matthews' pet projects. And that was one where they had built a fairly large Moog modular system, but every module was tied into digital to analog converters that tied into the mainframe computer. And then the one I was working on was a purely digital one. It was my first exposure to digital recording and playback and digital synthesis. It was a fairly advanced, again, based on mostly on vocal synthesis. But if you stripped out some of the complicated parts for the vocals, it was a really cool digital synthesizer. And vocals
had not interested me that much. I'd always left that to the singer and the band or whatever. I wanted instrumental music. I never really saw Stravinsky trying to write vocals, so it didn't interest me as much.
Yeah,
And
but like on the technological side, it's a good driver to get something done if you're trying to recreate something that humans do,
yes,
right? The voice.
it is. It
Exactly.
was very complicated. The guy who was heading the project, of that phase of it, he was trying to write an opera for computer, and it
Hmm.
was an incredible challenge. And I was just blown away at what he was accomplishing, but it wasn't what my creative heart wanted to accomplish. But it
Hmm.
was such good exposure. That was the first hard disk system I had seen. It was a 7 megabyte multi-platter hard drive. It was like, the platters are like this big. The thing was the size of a small refrigerator. You weren't allowed in the room with, because people smoked everywhere then. You weren't allowed to bring your cigarettes into the room
Hmm.
or anything. It was, digital etiquette that I was learning. That when I first was attached to some of the project, they weren't even able to do real-time sampling yet. Everything went to a pair of, I think they are ATR 440 Ampexes. You'd record them and then they could play back at 1/4 speed into the converters to get digitized. And
Hmm.
that changed, of course, later. But and it just continued on. There was another project then that started up a few years later with under a guy named Hal Alice, and that was another digital one that was an additive synthesis engine that was designed at the labs, but it used a couple of um, uh, mini computer systems sort of stacked to provide the what was not part of the purpose-built hardware built at Bell
Hmm.
Labs. And it could run other software. So there was some stuff coming in from Stanford, from John Chowney, and that turned out to be some very early FM synthesis, much more complex than what was later licensed to Yamaha to become the DX7 and all its
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
But I used some of that on one of my albums in 1979. It was on Bell Labs hardware, Stanford software, and I wasn't supposed to take it out of the company facilities, but I snuck some out anyway and flew it in on the 24 track.
So Larry, you really sort of like were almost say in an ideal position because you were like educating yourself, let's say within like all the possible or like from all the possible perspectives that
Yes,
one could have on music or on making music. Um,
you're
and
good.
I was listening to some of your music from the late 70s and early 80s to prepare myself talking to you, and sort of like I hope this is a compliment, but it really sounds like the sound, if you know what I mean, like the sound that everybody sort of like now refers to as that's how it's supposed to sound.
I was trying.
Like
No, thank you. I didn't think it was anything that special, and I'd heard similar kinds of comments,
Mhm.
even when I was doing the first album and working on the mix. And to me, it was just obvious. I'd listened to other recordings and go, well, no, they're missing the dimensionality, they're missing this, they're missing they're too timid in the frequency ranges or whatever. It has to have impact. And so I was just doing what I wanted to hear and was not hearing on many other recordings. It wasn't anything more than that. It was we all had the same equipment, we all had the same tape machines, and I had much smaller Moog rig than a lot of the other, you know, some of my contemporaries, because I didn't feel compelled to just, I remember going to some trade shows. I was like, oh, I've got 128 oscillators. What are you doing with them? Because three sounds pretty good. We're still all playing mono and multi-tracking. Um,
Mhm.
at
Mhm.
four, you can add a little more. At five, you're starting to get to the point where you're not really adding much. By six, really diminishing returns. It's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
getting any bigger. It's not getting any better. It's just getting more out of tune.
yeah.
And so I would rather stay with a smaller custom rig that I really knew inside out. At the same time, I was getting this tantalizing view of the future of what was going on at Bell. And I couldn't bring it home for the most part. It was, I knew what was going to happen, and I was trying to predict is, by the time I'm 70, maybe we'll have something like this in our homes. I hope. And then it happened in like 5 years. It was so quick. What I hadn't predicted was the microprocessor revolution, because I'd gotten an early microprocessor and I had selected one that was uh, there were these early chip sets that would come out, and you really had to program everything essentially in machine language. There were higher order. You could get a Microsoft with their first product, which was a basic compiler, and run it on an Altair. But if you really wanted to do anything efficient, and what I was trying to do with music and digital audio, every clock cycle counted. And so you couldn't use a higher end interpreter or compiler or anything. You needed to know what every cycle was doing and make your code efficient. So the way to do that was pick a microprocessor, get to know its instruction set, which would be anywhere from 60 to 100 instructions. You'd have a card that told you how many clock cycles it took to do this function. And you could start creating things, so you could have, for digital audio, steady audio throughput that wouldn't crack. And for music, even with, it wasn't MIDI yet. I was doing control voltage and triggers to the Moog, but you didn't want any jitter in the time, because the musician, by that time we knew that, like a jazz drummer, if you're pushing a little bit or pulling a little bit, it's on the order of tenths of a millisecond. That's detectable by the audience. And so, we're working in microsecond increments within the computer, but you want to make sure that output stayed there. So if you're going to have a little push, Roger Lynn got very good at understanding how to bake that into the code for the processor running the Lynn drums. But, I was really cognizant of that. So I picked a company that was in Pennsylvania called MOS Technologies, and they had a microprocessor called the 6502. Which was their flagship. And the thing I liked about it was that the Intel processors at the time, there's a function called an interrupt, which means that the computer says, hey, microprocessor, whatever you're doing, drop it, because I need this managed right now. And if that happens while a music or digital audio function is happening, it's going to screw everything up, because all of your carefully crafted code to tell the central processor what to do and which register to hit and when to hit it is thrown out the window, because something just overrode you. And the 6500, the MOS technology stuff, let you override that and go the other way. So if you're doing a spreadsheet or a word processor, it doesn't matter. If you're doing something in real time digital processing, it means the world. So I picked that one because they were nearby. I could actually within 2 hours drive to their factory. And the others were on the West Coast, whether it was up in Seattle or in Silicon Valley. So I thought it would be nice to have something a little closer to home. And I just learned that instruction set really well. Turned out I wasn't the only one, because Steve Wozniak had picked the exact same one to bake into the Apple I and then the Apple II. So I was way ahead of the game, because I had the machine language together on that. And I was trying to apply some of the things I was observing on the big mainframe at Bell Labs and apply them into creating these were basically early sequencers and little early digital audio things, but they were still not up to the industrial strength of taking them out on tour at the beginning. And I gradually brought that together and made it work.
It's really funny, because like what you're describing and like your interests and like getting the clock to be solid, right? On the processing side, I think I hear that in your music of that time. There's like a tightness to it that is sort of like very modern. I find it very contemporary sounding, this tightness. And really it was fascinating to me, because like when I was now thinking also, like, what did I mean by saying that it's the sound? Like if you now buy a plugin and you listen to the sounds, you can find sounds that sound like your sounds back then. That's what I mean. Like the people refer to like the preset as like something that Larry and others obviously did at the time, and this like it's a mystery to me how you guys, like when you listen to like something like very popular here is like Jean-Michel Jarre, for example. Like I don't know which year that, you know, that his first album came out, 76, 78 or something like that.
It was a little bit after my first one. I remember that Tangerine Dream was out a little before me, and
Yes.
Oxygen I think was a little after.
Yes, and but the if I listen to that music now, but even back then, it sounded like still sounded acoustic
Mhm.
because of the performance factor. And like only later I discovered like Tonto's Expanding Headband or stuff like that, where you could clearly hear people were playing, you know, like playing, and the sequencing was not such a big part of it. Maybe there was one element that was sequenced, like in Tangerine Dream or in Klaus Schulze's music, and everything else was played. But then and I mean you will be you know, more qualified to explain to me what happened, sort of like where things were getting more sequenced. Was that like late 70s where there were, you know what I mean, like
I
where
think,
there was.
well, there were more. I mean, the early, the Moog 9, I guess 960, 61 series. I'm sometimes don't remember all their model numbers, but the famous little white lights blipping along on the Moog modular, which could be cascaded, I guess, to be 24 note sequences, but they're very rigid and they're running off the clock. And they were actually the first digital chips in any Moog products were in those. They were early digital logic chips in the clocking and sequencing mechanism. But they tended to be fairly rigid, and it was very difficult to build something in. I never really used that much at all. I never had the Moog one. I had an Oberheim, smaller clones of those that thought were interesting. But Oberheim also made a digital sequencer, which was very early on. It was so early that it didn't even have RAM chips. It had huge circuit board of shift registers and an earlier way of doing computer memory, which meant you had to keep clocking through logic. Anyway, it gets, but it worked in a more modern way in that you could play in a part, including phrasing, including and there was even a way to set the sensitivity of that, so you could actually essentially quantize it if you wanted to with one setting, or you could have it find every last little nuance and mistake and leave it in, and then loop the sequence. And it was all stored in electronic memory and then played back and looped. And it also had transposition availabilities built in. And the very important thing in those days was that you could adjust the clock, of course, but the start button served as a hard reset button on each sequence. So if you were playing to a band track that had already been recorded with a drummer, no click track, and it's kind of moving in time, but it's pretty good. The drummer's good, but he's not a machine. So there's going to be a little drift. And that means that your 13 note sequence or whatever you're doing, you're going to get to that last note and you got to restart it at some point. You could tap along on the bar lines and you could make your sequence reclock to the band. And I mean, I would do that a lot on sessions and things, and you'd have to keep punching in. You might get 30 seconds or 40 seconds in, and then you'd blow it. And you have to hit the record button the same time you're hitting the reset button, but you could pick it up and make it sound fairly acceptable. So there were a lot of workarounds and kludges to get things going on that. But I think it was a matter of figuring out where you wanted to be. Was this supposed to be a Robotron, descendant of Metropolis, or was it supposed to be something that had some breath in it? And that was a production value judgment, an arrangement judgment. And a lot of sessions that I was doing for R&B things where they really didn't understand the electronics very well. They just wanted a good outcome. That was kind of tossed in my lap. It was like, just make it sound good. So I do what I thought was the right thing.
let's talk a little bit more about what happened after your first let's call it internship with Eddie Offord. Like, so what came after that? Like, how
Well,
did your relationship with Peter Gabriel happen, for example?
well, Peter started early in a sense because that little sequence of events that led to working with Yes, there were a number of baby bands that we had repeated that with. Nobody else became as successful as Yes. I mean, they literally went from 0 to 100 kilometers an hour within months, and
Mhm.
it was those of us that were there said, "See, we knew this, we knew they were going to do that." So the next one that came along, or I shouldn't say the next one, there were a couple of others. None of them really turned into much of anything, although a few people I'm still in touch with. But Genesis, they
Mhm.
the Trespass album, and then the I guess Nursery Crime. And I was going, well, they got a pretty cool sound in Mellotron. I wonder who these guys are. And our same little group, Genesis, had an entirely different set of record label issues. Yes, didn't. They were with a major label, and Ahmet Ertegun put the resources of Atlantic Records behind them, and they went. Genesis was a little different because Tony Stratton Smith, who had them on the Charisma label, didn't have a big distribution deal in America. Where the way that Yes was already structured within WEA. So Charisma had done licensing deals in other territories, and they had picked a label called Buddha Records here in the United States, which was an interestingly weird little label. They had had some success with some of their affiliate labels with some bubblegum things like the Archies and 1910 Fruit Gum Company, but these were like teeny bop things, nothing like Genesis, nothing like the cerebral thinking that was going into that. And got to meet Genesis because they were already doing dates in America, very, very few. But we did the same radio thing, called up Buddha and said, you got a band on your label. And in their case, it wasn't even like Atlantic, which said, oh yeah, yes, we're trying to make them into the next King Crimson. It was more, we think we can take them, to out of the UK to the US. This one was more like, we do? We have this band? And it was like, well, if you want to go to a show, we'll talk to their manager and we'll get you in. So they'd done a few dates. They'd actually had one very significant launch date at New York City at Philharmonic Hall. That's now David Geffen Philharmonic Center at Lincoln Center. But it was a radio sponsored concert for WNEW FM, which was the predominant rock station in New York at the time. And they had brought them in for a Christmas concert. So it wasn't a commercial venture. And they sold the place out because they really did have, Genesis had a following, but it was still sort of an underground following. They came back about 3 months later and they were playing, again, it was a small hall. So they were playing at Princeton University in a very 400 seats, 500 seats. And that's what the record company arranged for our little radio troupe to come in from an hour away in Pennsylvania and see them and then meet with the band. So my thought was, oh, I'm going to meet Tony Banks, and maybe he wants another copy of my dumb synthesizer. And he wasn't interested at all. But I met Peter that night. I met Jill Gabriel, who was there. A lot of the wives were touring with them. And the show was amazing. So it was a really nice time to have met them. It gets interesting in that there was a company, it actually still exists in a different form now, called Gem Records. Gem was an import company. They specialized in scouting trips to England and onto the continent, finding records that were not either released or were not properly being marketed in the US, of which Genesis was one of those. So they would import crates of finished Charisma LPs pressed in England to the US, and they had their own network of record stores with import sections. And they were selling more Genesis records than the Buddha label that didn't know that they even had Genesis on the label.
Mhm.
And so that had to change. But the interesting thing was, of course, there was a wonderful relationship established between Gem Records, Charisma, then Hit and Run Management, and all the people that became part of the Genesis group, and then later managed, Peter and Phil Collins, and it really grew into something quite big. Where I fit into this story was that both Rick Wakeman and John Anderson heard some demos I had brought with me in the summer of '73. And
Mhm.
both, they went to Rick's company, A&M, and to at WEA in London. They both loved the demos, but WEA said, we'll actually put you on a development deal. It wasn't just me, it was me and my friend who's Frank, who was also in the radio. He was the drummer in the band. And we had put together a kind of proto prog band ourselves, heavily focused on electronic music underpinning, but more conventional band. And we had a Warner's development deal. And we went in the studio and cut almost an album's worth of stuff. And then we didn't get picked up. It was also the time of the first oil crisis and a big recession and a lot of turmoil. So I retrenched. Warner's took a pass on it, but Gem Records, which was just getting started and starting to have their own labels, one of the people I knew through college radio from another station had graduated college, or he finished college. I don't think he even graduated. He went to work for Gem Records. And he and I were in touch about, well, things aren't going well with the band because Warner's took a pass, and they told us we can chop our demo anywhere. And he said, well, I'll introduce you to the guys at Gem. So I went down there, and they were based in New Jersey, which is even more convenient, even though they had ended up with offices in LA and London, and they turned into a big company. They were interested in the band. So they were thinking about picking it up, but then internal fractures in the band happened. People decided they couldn't afford to be poverty stricken anymore, kind of just left me. And within literally months, I think Warner's passed in December of '73. By the summer of '74, it was just me, all electronic production version of what was going to become Synergy. I even had the name already picked out. And the president of Gem Records and I sat down at a diner, and we just kind of worked out the numbers of how many records would have to be sold and all that. And I got signed, and I was on my way, using the techniques I had learned from Eddie Offord. Went back to the same studio where we had done the band demos that Warner Brothers had put us in here in the New York area. The die was sort of cast. But the Genesis thing was already blossoming because they had The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway through Gem. They were moving incredible quantities of that record. And so at that point, it was Marty Scott, who was the founder of Gem Records, and he's still the principal to this day. He still runs that label. He said, yeah, come with me. I'm meeting with Gail Coulson from Charisma. I'm meeting with Strat. I'm meeting with, we're going to go see Genesis. You want to come? We'll go say hi backstage. So I was part of all that. In the meantime, I'm starting to record the albums, and Genesis is beginning to change. Peter's getting ready to leave. Didn't know it at the time, but I kind of got insinuated in as part of the extension of the American distributor. And so I got to know Peter. I got to know all of them around that same period. And when Peter finally did leave, and he called up and said, and by then I had 2 of my albums out. Back in those days, you could chart on Billboard fairly high. I got not number 1 or anything, but I was in the, top 50, I think, in some markets. And he said, oh, I like what you do. Would you bring some of that to me for when I do my solo album? And it was
incredible.
Like, yeah. So that was all within about 2 years.
Do you think of yourself as being like a pretty proactive guy? Or did these things really just happen because you were so passionate and you were always hanging around with the right people?
I think it was strategic and luck. Some of it, no, I'm not proactive. In fact, I've constantly accused, my wife tells me all the time, I don't promote myself enough. And I tend to not just try to crank out quantities of material.
Mhm.
try to make it quality, and just, have a smaller catalog that's um, that's well respected, rather than people trying to separate wheat from chaff. So,
Mhm.
but I think that things like, I knew that the gem distribution was really good. I could see, the more I got an insight into how the business worked, I structured the publishing for myself the way I wanted it to be. The behind the scenes part of it, and also knowing, even things like the studio, that I'd seen bands run their royalty accounts into the ground by spending too much time in the studio. So as soon as I could get a good quality studio recorder at home, I knew that would pay back. So I bought an MCI fairly, I think 1977, almost,
Mhm.
very early in my career. So all of a sudden I was starting to cut back on expenses and make these things, the recordings, profitable almost from day one. And of course, not having a band and not going on tour helped. But then, I saw these more strategic things, rather than going out and doing the huckster thing. Really didn't appeal to me at all. Radio
And
interviews,
so
that's great.
so with Peter, was that the first time that you were actually touring?
No, I had toured. Gem Records had another band called Nectar, which,
Nectar,
they
yeah.
were, they were living in Seeheim for
Mhm.
years, but they had been, if you, the backstory on that is that they were, three English musicians, one Scot, and their lighting guy, who was also British, and they had done the same gravitational drift into Germany that the Beatles had done, except they didn't
Mhm.
go back triumphant to the UK. They married German girls. The crew was a mix of Brits and German, West German citizens at the time. They signed to Bellophone, and so their label was German, and they basically just stayed put. They never really went back, and they were picked up for US distribution through the Gem Group, and it, almost out of the gate, ended up having a gold record with back Remember the Future, which was not their
Mhm.
first album, but their first one in North America that made a splash.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
they were going to be touring. Well, they were going to be doing an album right after I finished the first Synergy album, and it was just on the cusp of release. So I did the promotion on that, and we'd gotten to know each other a little bit. Well, Remember the Future was out, and they were touring, and they invited me to come work on their sessions with them to add an electronic overlay, which was great. So we worked at Chateau de Airville, which was, supposed to be this big famous French studio, and it was a picturesque piece of architecture with absolutely horrible recording technology, only because nothing worked, nothing was maintained. 24 track
Mhm.
machine was always breaking down. So we actually couldn't continue there. It was such an untenable situation. So their management and label moved everything to Air Studios in London at Oxford Circus, which at that point, under still under the direction of George Martin, and Jeff Emmerich was a staff engineer. It was a lot of the Beatles people, so I was thrilled. And
Mhm.
we finished the album up there. I think David Gilmour was in a different room there working on his solo album. It was a really fertile time, and a lot of things got done. But I had done so much with the album that when they came to tour it, they said, can you come on the road and recreate some of that stuff? So I did. And it was my first time touring. I'd never done the club thing. I mean, very early on in high school as a rank,
Mhm.
amateur, not in the business at all. But I had skipped that whole working your way up through the clubs and paying your dues thing. So my first show with them was an arena show at a university in Illinois, big stadium gymnasium kind of thing. And we did that. We toured the US and Canada over that next period of time, touring that album, spring, I guess winter, spring into summer of 76. And then by then I knew I was going to be working with Peter on his solo album, but I didn't know what the long-term thing was. I knew I'd be on the album, didn't know that he was going
Mhm.
to ask to tour. And I didn't know I'd be invited back for a second album, or if there would be a second album. And
Mhm.
maybe you will rejoin Genesis for all we know. We just don't know. So leaving all the options open. But then the Peter thing did happen, and it toured. And Nectar had moved to the United States. They decided to relocate after they had sort of played out Europe as much as they could, and they thought America's the next big market. So they moved here, but it didn't work out well. The singer, songwriter, guitarist who was at the core of the band didn't take to America, and he left and moved back, and it just sort of devolved. That they've kept it going with replacement people, and they're still touring. They're still
Mhm.
gigging. Some of them are
Mhm.
nearing 80 years old, but they're still doing it. And more power to them. But with Peter, it was very attractive. His management and team was really determined to see it a success. And when the tour happened, I did that one, and then the next album, and then the next tour. And, it got down to the core band, which with Peter, but Tony and Jerry Murata and myself, and then a few different changes of guitarists till David Rhodes became the guy, and he's still
Mhm.
there. And it was almost 10 years worth of that core work with Peter.
Incredible.
So,
Incredible. And how did you or how do you like being on the road? Do you have any
I
was it attractive or for you or
yeah, for a while, very attractive. I used to like it a lot. I think it's because there wasn't that much at home.
Mhm.
And when you're in your 20s, I found it really exciting. And there were times when it was the grind of the airport. I don't have to tell you the amount of um, what I was starting to find, because I remember I was still signed, I still had solo albums that were due, and I was getting further and behind. The label was very good with me and allowing me a lot of leeway. So I was supposed to deliver one album a year. That was not happening if I was doing Peter and then touring and
Mhm.
then trying to get something in. So a 5-year contract stretched out to be like 11 by the time,
Mhm.
without any punitive stuff, but it just kept going. And I was itching, I liked being on the road, but I also liked the access to Bell Labs. And that, of course, that was going to be changing soon when the telephone company was broken up by the courts. So, there were a lot of different things going on, but there were things that I wanted to do. And I had other projects. Remember, Peter early on was something I found enormously creative. I like him. I liked him. I still like him. I think he's one of the most talented people I've ever had an opportunity to work with creatively. But at the same time, the records were not the platinum records that they would become later, after Sledgehammer. And
Mhm. Yeah.
other records that I had worked on, mostly within Jim Steinman as a writer producer, which started out with Meatloaf in his first 2 albums, but then a lot of other artists, everything from the Everly Brothers to Air Supply to Barbra Streisand, but particularly Bonnie Tyler. I had worked with Jim as either an informal associate producer and then later under contract as an associate producer on Bonnie Tyler. And we had done Total Eclipse of the Heart in the middle of one of the Gabriel tours. And I'd have to look at the calendars to figure out exactly where that was. But it just exploded. Huge amount of stuff, a huge amount of sales, and the fallout on that. And, thank goodness it was a union date. I still get residuals from it. It was a wonderful thing. And then I was asked to come on and be the associate producer on the follow-up album, but it would be a commitment of nearly a year for that. Peter wasn't doing anything. And then in the middle of that, he called me to say, I'm doing the new album the one that would become So. And I
Mhm.
couldn't leave New York. They paid me a lot of money up front, and it was way out of the league of where the Gabriel organization had been at that time. So I don't want it to sound like it's just a money thing, but I had
No,
obligation,
no.
and it was
Yeah, for
creative,
sure.
and I was given a lot of freedom and leeway on production on those recordings. And I just, that was sort of where it changed. And then Peter wanted to change the touring band, so I wasn't part of that anymore, and things just evolved in different ways. But it also let me get back to my own recordings. So I had
Yeah.
one big one that I spent after Bonnie Tyler and after Peter was out on the road with So. I basically stayed at home and really did what I needed to do on electronic music recordings and dove back into that. I was getting a little bit pulled away by the rock and roll machine from what I felt were my roots in that. And in the interim, I had my sort of mentor in all of this, Wendy Carlos, who was the person who had set the bar for what I felt a lot of electronic musicians should be doing. And we had
Mhm.
known each other casually. We got to be very close friends over that period in the early 1980s. And
Mhm.
she was working on some of her microtonal things. She was wonderful. I was working on my album Metropolitan Suite, and I was sharing as I was writing, and I've saved them to this day. She would call my answering machine and say, that little phrase on this, it would, instead of da 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 da, wouldn't it be better as da 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 da? It was like, yeah, it would be. And so she was there. Actually got photos of her when we were doing the LP mastering over at Master Disc. She came on the sessions with me. So it was really a creative time, and I will always appreciate them. I broke off writing an email to her this morning so that we can do what we're doing right now, which I'll pick up this afternoon.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, like this, by that time, like in the like 86 or 87, you were already in the business, let's say almost 20 years, like 18, 17 years or something like that, of doing things, right? And sometimes I feel like if we're like, once we get a little older, we kind of like see that there are these phases, right? Like things that sort of like these brackets somehow of activity, and and for me it's interesting also that in the I was like, I became sort of like a conscious music listener at the age of like maybe 10, like in 82, 83, right? And I still remember, and even like if I go back now, it almost felt like as if every year had its own sound, because there was sort of like some new technology coming out that was like I don't know, I remember like Quantec Room Simulator,
Yep.
like these kinds of
Exactly.
pieces of gear that the Fairlight, obviously, you work with that, right? And
Yep.
and all of these things, and then sort of like in the middle of the 80s, like it felt as if like the business, I mean, or just the music sonically had changed so much from the late 70s. Like striking to me, like looking back, how big the difference in production and even like the I guess the listener's taste, how that has changed. It's sort of incredible.
There was a
And
cultural change that was going. I mean, when I jumped in, obviously I was much younger, but of course, as a fan listener, the Beatles just shifted the world on its axis, and very rapidly after that, as their evolution was so quick, the culture was, they in here in the States, the Kennedy assassination was this incredible dark cloud that happened at the end of November, just around Thanksgiving holiday. And in early December was when I Want to Hold Your Hand was released and started up the charts on radio. So it was almost this release from this national PTSD. And
Mhm.
within the month of January, the Beatles started to take over, at least in youth culture. Us baby boomers, the post-war babies who were all coming of age, and it was this cultural shift that took place. And then Vietnam War starts to ramp up a year later, and the anti-war movement, all these things that the culture that those of us that were born after the war, World War II had ended, and this new normality, but this kind of banal middle America white bread normality, but it had been very stable for quite a long time. And from, not that the Beatles caused it by themselves, but maybe they were even symptomatic of it, but everything started to change. The anti-war culture immediately morphed into music that just 2-3 years later, after the Beatles pop stuff, is becoming a serious cultural touchstone of the movement. And then, not to go through the whole history with Woodstock and all that, but the culture itself just went through such huge changes. And as that was happening, the technology was happening too. So whether it was electronic music or computers or other.
It's amazing. It's amazing that you're pointing this out. I never had thought about that, but I remember like one of the first listening experience I vividly remember is listening to the White Album, and I must have been 3 years old, maybe. Yeah, I guess so, right? Something like that. And the White Album wasn't even like, was maybe 7 years old then, or I guess it was released 68 or
Yeah.
yeah, right. So
I remember because I was just, that was the first one I could drive myself to buy because I was just old enough.
and I remember when I was listening to that, and that don't get me wrong here, but it already sounded old to me.
Yeah, I know what you meant. They were starting to sound. I remember feeling that, oh, the Beatles are getting a little stodgy in a sense, because the West Coast, bands that I like Jefferson Airplane and some of the others were just kind of pushing things a little further than they were. But I was beginning to, at the same time, I was beginning to feel very much like you were, that they were sounding old. I was also beginning to appreciate that they were part of the lexicon that writers like George Gershwin and Richard Rodgers and the great standard songbook writers, that Lennon and McCartney probably belonged in that. Not and maybe they're allowed to sound a little old because in a sense they're part of an older tradition. I don't know that White
exactly.
fit in with a Gershwin piece.
Yeah, but I think because for me there was this like, I first heard it 5-6 years later after it was released, right? And to me it felt as if that already at that point in 73 it was an old record. I don't know if it already felt old when it was released.
It felt old. Some of it felt old when I brought it home, and I started.
Okay, wow.
I was sophisticated enough culturally, at least, even though I didn't grow up in the UK, to understand some of the music hall references, that there was a pub tradition that was beginning to emerge in some of the writing, like Honey Pie or some of those kinds of, it was a different thing. It wasn't quite an American thing either, but you could see it was from an older generation. But no, it felt it where something like Rubber Soul was avant-garde or Revolver when I brought it home and put it on the turntable. White Album, not quite so much. And then Abbey Road was a mix. There were some parts of it that, okay, Maxwell Silverhammer feels old, or Oh Darling feels old, but then other things, particularly, and I didn't recognize it at the time, but She's So Heavy or something like that. Oh, it's the Moog, or Here Comes the Sun. It's the Moog synthesizer in there that I knew what it was, but I didn't quite figure the context for myself until looking back on it.
So I mean, we're already talking for let me see.
An hour and
hour and a half, but that's fine. So what really kind of, tell me what happened in the 80s, like technologically, and also how did production techniques change? Why did we get such a different sound in just about like 5-6 years?
Oh, well, I think one of the things that had happened was the for me, I'm going to do it from my perspective, but I think it did a lot. One of the challenges of touring early on with Nectar and with Peter for the early years was the lack of memory recall on the modular Moogs or even the mini Moogs and stuff. Everything, I'd have a headphone, I'd be trying to dial up sounds and hope that I was hitting them close for the next section of the song. And one of the things I really wanted was some way of memorizing what it was. Moog had a project already going that was already called a memory Moog, but it was really like a mini Moog, but it had computer storage of the patches. And
Mhm.
it was shelved in favor of the Polymoog, which was a big polyphonic instrument. It was they had a change in administration, and I wasn't in complete agreement with that, even though I was helped with the promotion. But out on the West Coast, Dave Smith and Sequential Circuits picked up the same concept and they ran with it, and they came out with the Prophet 5. So they had 40 memory slots. They could recall everything, um, any patch, and got that for Peter's 1978, the latter half of 78 tour. And it was a very early one. We picked up, I think, serial number 48 or something. And I immediately put in an order for myself. And so we had the two of them on the road within months. And that meant that the sounds were great. But the thing that went out, I guess when we were doing that tour and went out to the factory in Silicon Valley, met with Dave Smith and the people that had developed it. And they said, they come back to the factory. What's blown us away is we preloaded it with 40 presets that we thought would be kind of universal sounds. And so many of them were coming back with no changes. Nobody changes the presets. And you started hearing those same sounds on a lot of records. And for me, it wasn't at all. What I was doing was I was taking my patched modular sounds and building a set for Peter's show that was based on the sounds that I had cobbled together individually on recording days. And now I could take them out on the road. So for me, it was perfect, but no, there was almost nothing of the presets left. And some of them were good and I hated to wipe them out, but that was that. It wasn't that complex an instrument. You could always repatch. So I could see that was happening. And then, there was competition. Yamaha and Roland and others are starting to come out with equivalent kind of instruments. And I was then contacted by Moog when they reactivated the Memory Moog project to create their 6-voice version of the Prophet 5, called the Memory Moog. And would I contribute patches to it? And I did about a third of the factory set, which was not an easy thing to do. It's easier to write melodies for me than to sit there in a stark room, soundproof room, and come up with an interesting sound. And I was also sort of instructed by the marketing staff, it's got to be really impressive in the music store. Because I kept saying, well, this is really big and fat, but this is totally unusable as a production piece for a recording. And they go, doesn't matter. We're selling synthesizers. We're not making records. And, so I caught on. I knew what they were getting at, but that was hard. But the factory sounds became the thing. And eventually they even dropped programming, or what the DX7, which, hit in 83, 84, it was so complex to program. It had enormous capabilities, but through that little tiny LCD window and without any, good, meaningful computers to plug it into, it was an impossibility. So nobody was changing the presets. They just became what they were. And that meant that the Bell Sound Rhodes piano and certain sounds, they were just everywhere. And I think that affected record production. There was very little of going back to the modular. People didn't want to spend the time to do it. I was lucky on some of the records that I worked on. I'm thinking in particular Foreigner, because I worked on 2 of their albums, on Foreigner 4 and Agent Provocateur. And a lot of the tracks on those were based on pulsing modular sounds. It was sort of old school already by the early 80s. But they were fine with it. But I think they were successful enough that they weren't worried about the studio clock ticking or anything. Others were going, well, just hit the buttons, find me a sound. And a producer or an artist would go, yeah, that's good. Okay, let's make that the sound. I go, well, we can change it. No, that's good enough. That's fine. We got to be out of here at 5 o'clock. And that's
interesting.
That's what
so
happened.
it's the capability of recall, let's say, that drove that, changed more than the actual sounds themselves.
Yes,
You think?
it became what happened at NAMM became important. What was heard on the floor at NAMM became what was on the records in the next months. And that's where the
Mhm.
chase was. But the original, everything we talked about an hour ago, what
Mhm.
was going on and with Stockhausen or Pierre Schaeffer or this long history of crafting sounds by other means than traditional instruments was just
Mhm.
being left in the dust. And I don't like that. It still
Oh,
bothers
yeah.
me. Even today. It's funny because I mean I use almost everything's in software, but with Spectrasonics instruments like Omnisphere is one of my go-tos, and
Mhm.
I'll talk with other users. They'll go, "Well, which library are you using?" It's like I don't. I just start with a 4 oscillator clean slate, the way I used to have patch cords draped around my neck and Moog module in front of me, and start patching. And I'll build from scratch on waveform because, to be honest, I can't be bothered to go through that much library stuff. If I've got a sound in my head, I can make it quicker than I can find it.
Yeah, and that also means there's always going to be some variation, and there's something special about it. And it, as you say, it's not meant to work as sort of like a standalone soundscape, but as a musical instrument or a part in a musical piece, right? Yeah,
I,
I find, yeah.
I tend to build it out of a lot of little pieces. That was, some of what Wendy Carlos had shown the world in electronic music early on, that Hockatine and other older techniques used with, very sounds that had not really been heard or used before, even as applied to classical writing, could be very valuable. And I tried to apply some of those, but they were done on the modular. I know on one of the things on Games Without Frontiers is all made up of lots of little pieces, lots of little
Mhm.
individual patches through some of it with the Moog, a little bit with some of the other instruments, but um, they're all glued together into what became the sound. You couldn't really get a Prophet 5 or a Roland Juno something or even anything much later, Kurzweil, and just have the 10 fingers on the keys and make that work. It just doesn't work like that.
Mhm.
It's a big organ. Sometimes
Yeah.
that's appropriate, but it's not going to, I like breaking it down into the little fractals that are going to that you're going to reconstruct to make a sound, a bigger sound.
Yeah, and for me also the layering techniques, just like what you would do when you're orchestrating for an orchestra,
Exactly.
right? Like the idea to have layers that you can then glue, like you said, like glue together somehow to become one sound.
Yes.
That's just a wonderful thing to do. And like I have started one musical project last year where I was purely only using synthesizers, right, and plugins actually. And the idea was to only use like the factory presets. That was the original idea. Okay, but what I ended up doing is like layering like 8 different synth sounds, to make one new sound, but I think it's that sort of like creativity to find a new texture or like a new interaction of elements, really, that is fascinating to us, I guess, as people who are like deeply interested in creating sound worlds.
I think you're absolutely right. I think part of it is the arranger's mind, and how can you keep the sounds from stepping on each other? Because if you just layer a lot of things, you just end up with a big mud puddle and nothing is clear, and then you're taking up too much sonic space. And if it is in a more rock oriented thing, you're stepping on the drums, you're stepping on the bass. So I'd rather deconstruct it down to the component parts and then put it back together using only what's necessary. And I'm
Yeah,
not always
that's cool.
I don't always adhere to that, but but the layering is good. I mean, I'm not saying that's wrong, especially if you're creating an interesting texture
Yeah,
out of that. But if
yeah.
that whole module needs to stay out of the way of the other parts.
I'm very much a rebel when it comes to layering, but I hear you. Just like as you said, like an hour and a half ago, like 3 oscillators are enough. You don't need 6. Like everything it's just gonna be more wishy-washy.
Yeah.
You know, and
I remember having a talk with Roger Powell, and you know, I'd known at Bell Labs and stuff. We were talking. I don't know if it was at a Todd Rundgren show or something, maybe a Bowie show. Because actually, when I was working with Peter, Bowie had asked me to do one of the tours, and I stayed loyal to Peter, but I recommended Roger for it, and he took the gig on that.
Mhm.
But whatever it was, we were talking about how everything was getting too overly complex at the expense of the music. And in production, we could take a micro Moog, which was a 1 oscillator, you know, really the lowest end of the Moog instruments, and with a 3-octave keyboard, but it had a nice filter. It had a few things. Give me a micro Moog, a good digital reverb, early digital reverb like a Lexicon, and then an Eventide harmonizer, and you could do just about anything. And that would be enough. That's all you'd need to take on overdub sessions, given enough freedom and and enough track space, you could create it.
Yes, yes. You know, like I've been doing this ambient looping with my guitar, and the way that I do that is I'm using a little feedback system, right, where I have 2 loopers that do feed each other, and so over the years I started doing that like almost 30 years ago, but ever since that I can do that in the computer, like starting about in 2005. What I realized was, because it is a feedback system, adding another looper doesn't make any difference.
Yeah.
Like if you have 2 elements interacting in a fractal way,
yeah,
like with recursion, like there you can add more elements, but it doesn't make it more complex and doesn't make it more interesting.
they just kind of drift into the background. And no, I know
Yes.
exactly what you mean. There's an album that I did, which was in 1980, and it's really interesting because the titles of the tracks are artificial intelligence with different dates. But it was a sort of semi-auto composing piece of software that a friend of mine who had founded his own small synthesizer company, Paya, had developed. And I had hacked into my first Prophet to get straight into the digital inputs that control the oscillators from the computer, which was another one of these MOS 6500 family computers, similar to the Apples at the time. And I it wasn't interesting enough just with that, so I did looping, but it was all done digitally, not with multiple Studer machines like I had done earlier. It was Delta Lab, which had a very good digital delay system that you could buy a module with just a ton of memory, and it would do these incredibly long loops. And on each iteration coming back, it actually had built into the hardware filtering and ways to actually do some pitch modulations. So it was really interesting. So I let it was fairly simple, computer running the software. Software was running a list of notes I had said you're allowed to use. And then there was a blacklisted set of notes you can't use, but you can put them together anyway. And sometimes they're going to be harmonic and sometimes anharmonic, but at least I was restricting its world. Let it run, controlled the Prophet, picked the patches on that, and then went through this looping system and just went straight into the MCI. And it's really like you said, I tried adding more, running another loop on the loop and stuff, and it just didn't make any. I actually pulled back on some of the length of some of the loops just because one on its own was complex, but it didn't make any sense in the long run. And this was a long
Yes.
time ago, 40, a
And
little over 40 years ago. And I just digitized the master on that. So I'm hoping to do
good.
our next subject, which is surround mixing.
Yes, yes, yes. But we won't talk about that publicly.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Well, you've been doing
Hey.
it, and I've been doing. My first album was done in quad, and I have the digital masters of that. It was distributed on well, it was a variation on 8-track cassette 8-track cartridge.
Mhm,
It
mhm.
was the Q16. And I don't know if there were any players. I have one that I bought on eBay, but it doesn't work. And it was
Yeah, it's so it's
on the tail end of it. You're back. I got to find you here.
yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what happened there.
Yeah, you
And-
froze up, but I could see the recording was still going and the messages were still going, so that I was still plugged into Zoom.
Okay, good. So that means I'll
I
have
never
to
left.
edit this video a little bit, which is fine.
That's okay. You know what? I need like 2 minutes break. And then
Yeah,
you can,
if you don't mind, let's just say goodbye now, and we'll meet again to talk about the surround and
okay,
spatial stuff.
that's fine.
Okay, and okay.
Okay,
Hey, thank you so much, Larry. Bye bye
wonderful.
for now.
Bye for now.
Bye
Enjoy your dinner.
bye bye.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye bye. Talk to you soon. Bye.